Normandy, August 8, 1944. Oberscharfer Michael Whitman sat behind the controls of Tiger 007, his breath steady, his nerves calm. Around him, the rumble of German tank columns rolled through the Norman hedgerows like a steel fist preparing to smash through Allied lines. Behind Whitman's turret crew, conversations were light, almost casual. They had reason to be confident. In the preceding months, Whitman had become a legend among German tankers. 138 tank kills, an entire British armor column annihilated at Villers-Bocage. His Tiger tank, with its 100 millimeters of frontal armor and the devastating 88 millimeter gun, had earned a reputation as an invulnerable fortress. Ahead, camouflaged in the hedgerows near the village of Saint-Tegen-de-Cramesnil, Trooper Joe Ekins peered through the telescopic sight of his Sherman Firefly. Ekins was no veteran ace. He'd fired exactly 5 practice rounds from a Firefly's 17-pounder gun before being thrown into combat. His tank, a modified American Sherman, looked almost comical beside the towering Tigers. German crews had spent 2 years mocking the Sherman's short-barreled 75 millimeter gun, calling it a Tommy Cooker and a Ronson, a sardonic reference to the American cigarette lighter slogan, "Lights first time, every time." But something had changed. The Firefly in Ekins's hands was not the Sherman the Germans had grown to dismiss. From 800 meters away, Ekins's commander whispered a single order: "Fire." The 17-pounder roared. A streak of white-hot metal screamed through the summer air at 2,900 feet per second. The armor-piercing discarding sabot round, traveling faster than the crack of a bullwhip, sliced through the haystack Whitman's Tiger was using for concealment and punched straight through 82 millimeters of nickel steel plate. Inside Tiger 007, the world became fire and fragmentation. The Invincible was burning. History books often gloss over these mechanical details. To ensure you never miss the engineering truths hidden behind the myths of the Second World War, secure your position in our ranks by subscribing now. The Arrogance. Why the Tiger was invincible. To understand the terror of the Tiger, you must first understand what Allied tank crews faced in the summer of 1944. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger I entered service in 1942 as Germany's answer to Soviet heavy armor. It weighed 54 tons, carried a crew of 5, and was powered by a Maybach HL 230 engine producing 700 horsepower. But it was the armor and the gun that made the Tiger a nightmare. The frontal hull was 100 millimeters thick. The turret face ranged from 135 to 150 millimeters, and even the side armor, 80 millimeters of roll homogeneous nickel steel plate, was thicker than the frontal armor of most Allied tanks. This armor wasn't just thick. It was exceptionally well manufactured. German quality control ensured a Brinell hardness index of 255 to 280, the optimal range for that thickness. British and American tests confirmed that the Tiger's side armor, though nominally 80 millimeters, had resistance equivalent to 92 millimeters of British armor. And because the Tiger's armor was thicker than the caliber of most Allied anti-tank guns, those guns were overmatched, a technical term meaning the shell lacked sufficient diameter to generate the hydraulic shock necessary to spall or crack the plate. Then there was a gun, the 88 millimeter KWK-36. Originally developed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the Flak 18, it was adapted for tank use and became the most feared weapon on the Western Front. It fired a 10-kilogram armor-piercing round at 1,000 meters per second, capable of penetrating 200 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, enough to defeat any Allied tank from front, side, or rear. At 1,500 meters, a Tiger could kill a Sherman before the Sherman's 75 millimeter gun could even scratch its paint. British and American tank crews knew this. In Normandy, British Commonwealth forces faced over 70% of German armor, including elite Waffen-SS Panzer units equipped with Tigers and Panthers. Standard Shermans with 75 millimeter guns had no chance. Crews developed grim tactics. Use 4 Shermans to swarm a single Tiger. Hope 3 die while the 4th flanks and hits the engine deck. The survival rate was catastrophic. The Germans knew it too, and they were confident. Tiger commanders often radioed back to headquarters with dismissive reports about Allied armor, describing Sherman formations as target practice rather than threats. Panzer crews painted kill rings on their gun barrels, white circles denoting each Sherman destroyed, with some barrels decorated like carnival poles. In tank depots behind the front lines, maintenance crews joked about the ease of their work. Tigers rarely suffered penetrating hits, so most repairs involved track maintenance and engine work rather than patching armor. The psychological effect on Allied crews was devastating. Sherman tankers coined a bitter phrase. A good day is one where you only lose 2 tanks to get 1 Tiger. The Tiger's dominance wasn't just mechanical, it was doctrinal. German tactics emphasized offensive positions where Tigers could leverage their superior range and armor. A single Tiger, hull down behind a bocage hedgerow or position on a ridge, could control an entire sector. Allied armor had to advance across open ground, expose the fire from ranges where they couldn't effectively retaliate. The mathematics were brutal. A Tiger could engage and destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters, while a Sherman had to close to within 500 meters, through a killing field, to have any chance of a penetrating hit on the Tiger's frontal armor. Intelligence reports from captured German tank crews revealed an arrogance bordering on contempt. One Unterscharfer, interrogated after his Tiger was immobilized by mechanical failure near Cannes, stated matter-of-factly, "We do not fear your tanks. We fear your air power and your artillery. But tank against tank? There's no contest." This confidence was not unfounded. By July 1944, the average lifespan of Sherman crew in Normandy was measured in days, not weeks. Replacement crews arrived at the front with hollow eyes, having heard the stories from survivors. Some refused to board their assigned Shermans. Officers had to threaten courts-martial to maintain unit cohesion. The crisis, when the Sherman met the Tiger. On June 13, 1944, 5 days after D-Day, the world watched as that confidence was validated in blood. At Villers-Bocage, a French market town south of Cannes, the British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, advanced along Route 175 in a long, vulnerable column. Their mission, break through German lines and encircle Panzer Lehr Division. Leading the advance was a squadron of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, equipped with Cromwell tanks and a handful of the newly deployed Sherman Fireflies. At 0800 hours, Michael Wittmann's Tiger 007, accompanied by 3 other Tigers from the 1st SS Panzer Corps, emerged from a tree line on Hill 213. What followed was a masterclass in armored ambush. Wittmann's column moved parallel to the British advance, hidden by the dense Norman hedgerows, then struck from flank with devastating precision. Within minutes, the British column was ablaze. Cromwells, with their thin armor and underpowered guns, were obliterated at point-blank range. Half-tracks erupted in flames, their infantry passengers scrambling into ditches as machine gun fire raked the roadside. Officers abandoned their positions, fleeing westward to the town as Tigers prowled behind them, methodically destroying vehicle after vehicle. The scene was apocalyptic. Black smoke rose in columns above the Norman countryside, visible for miles. Wittmann pressed into the town square, Place Jeanne d'Arc, and found himself momentarily isolated, his accompanying Tigers delayed by the narrow streets and debris. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, surrounded by burning British vehicles. And yet, he continued the assault. His loader worked with mechanical precision, ramming shell after shell into the breach as Wittmann identified targets with cold efficiency. A Sherman appeared at an intersection. Wittmann fired. The Sherman's turret lifted off its ring and tumbled into the street. A Cromwell reversed frantically down an alley. Wittmann traversed, fired, and the Cromwell exploded, blocking the alley with flaming wreckage. Then, in the chaos, a Sherman Firefly rounded a corner. The Firefly's crew knew their 17-pounder could penetrate the Tiger. Wittmann knew it too. For a brief moment, the two machines faced each other across the cobblestones of the town square, a duel between the old order and the new. The duel was brief and brutal. Wittmann fired first. His shell smashed into a nearby building. An explosion showered debris over a Cromwell tank, burying it in rubble. But the Firefly's gunner stayed calm and fired. The armor-piercing round struck Wittmann's Tiger and temporarily damaged his sighting optics, throwing sparks across the interior. But Wittmann's armor held. His driver reversed into cover. His gunner, momentarily blinded by the impact, cleared his vision and reacquired the target. Whitman fired again. The Firefly exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that shattered windows across the square. By the time British forces withdrew, Whitman had destroyed over 20 Allied vehicles in less than 15 minutes. The street leading out of Villers-Bocage was littered with burning hulks, their crews dead or captured. The action at Villers-Bocage became legend. For the Germans, it confirmed their superiority. For the Allies, it was a wake-up call. The standard Sherman was a death trap. Crews returning from Normandy told stories of watching entire platoons incinerated in seconds, of Tigers emerging from fog banks like medieval dragons, of desperate attempts to flank that ended in fireballs visible from kilometers away. Something had to change. The question was no longer whether Allied armor could defeat the Tiger in open battle. Intelligence analysts had concluded it could not. The question was how to give Allied tank crews a fighting chance without waiting for the next generation of heavy tanks, which were still months away from production. The answer already existed, sitting in design bureaus and proving grounds across Britain. But it required desperation, ingenuity, and a willingness to bend the rules of industrial design. The solution, the engineering miracle. The answer already existed, but it required desperation, ingenuity, and a willingness to bend the rules of industrial design. In early 1943, British tank designers faced a nightmare scenario. Their homegrown tanks, Cromwell's, Churchill's, Valentines, were either too lightly armored or too undergunned to face German heavies. The Americans had begun mass-producing the M4 Sherman, and through Lend-Lease, Britain was receiving thousands. The Sherman was reliable, mechanically sound, and available in vast numbers, but its 75mm M3 gun was woefully inadequate against Tigers and Panthers. Meanwhile, the British had developed the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder, a towed anti-tank gun that was, by 1943, the most powerful Allied anti-tank weapon in service. The gun fired a 17-pound, 7.7-kilogram, armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, 908 meters per second, for standard rounds, and 3,950 feet per second, 1,204 meters per second, for armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition known as APDS. At 1,000 yards, the 17-pounder firing APDS could penetrate 231 millimeters of armor angled at 30 degrees. That was more penetration than the German 88mm KWK-36 and nearly double the capability of the American 90mm gun mounted on the M26 Pershing, which wouldn't arrive in Europe until final months of the war. The 17-pounder could punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges where the Tiger couldn't effectively retaliate. But there was a problem. The 17-pounder was massive. The gun had a 55 caliber barrel, meaning the barrel length was 55 times the diameter of the bore, and required an enormous breech and recoil mechanism. No existing British tank turret could accommodate it. Several attempts were made to mount it in the Cromwell and the Challenger tank, but both projects faced delays and production challenges. The Challenger, in particular, proved mechanically unreliable, and its tall profile made an easy target. By late 1943, British tank commanders were desperate for a solution. Then Major George Bridie of the Royal Armor Corps had an idea that seemed absurd on its face. What if they mounted the 17-pounder sideways in a Sherman turret? It sounded impossible. The Sherman turret was cramped even with the smaller 75mm gun. The turret crew, commander, gunner, and loader already worked in claustrophobic conditions, surrounded by ammunition racks, radio equipment, and the gun's recoil mechanism. Adding a gun that was physically larger in every dimension seemed like a fantasy. But British engineers at the Woolwich Arsenal in Vickers began experimenting in late 1943, driven by the knowledge that every day without a solution meant more dead tank crews in Normandy. They rotated the 17-pounder's recoil mechanism 90 degrees, a modification that required redesigning the breech assembly and the gunner's controls. They moved the radio from the turret to the hull, sacrificing some communication efficiency for space. They eliminated the hull machine gunner position entirely, converting that space into ammunition stowage of the 17-pounder's massive two-piece rounds. And in the most radical modification, they cut a hole in the rear turret bustle to allow the breech to recoil outside the turret ring during firing. The result was cramped, awkward, and required the loader perform acrobatic feats to shove the two-piece ammunition, shell in separate charge, into the breech. The loader had to stand at an angle, bracing himself against the turret wall, and time his movements to avoid being struck by the recoiling breech. One loader described the experience as like fighting a war inside a telephone booth. But it worked. By January 1944, the first Sherman Fireflies rolled off conversion lines in Britain and into tank regiments preparing for D-Day. The British kept the Fireflies' existence as quiet as possible. They knew German intelligence would eventually learn about it. But operational security was tight. Fireflies were mixed into standard Sherman platoons at a ratio of 1 Firefly per troop, a unit of 4 tanks. This ensured every small unit had the firepower to engage German heavies while maintaining the appearance of standard Sherman formations. When Fireflies landed in Normandy in June 1944, German tank crews were caught off guard. The first reports came from Panzer commanders who described encountering Shermans with abnormally long barrels that could penetrate Tiger armor at ranges previously considered safe. Within weeks, German commanders issued standing orders: identify and destroy Fireflies first. The long barrel of the 17-pounder made Fireflies easy to spot, even at distance. Some Firefly crews began painting their barrels with disruptive camouflage patterns, white bands and splotches, to disguise the gun's length and prevent German gunners from singling them out. Others welded false muzzle brakes onto standard Sherman barrels in the same troop, hoping to confuse enemy observers about which tank posed a real threat. The psychological warfare was intense. German crews knew that somewhere in every Allied tank formation was a machine that could kill them, but identify it under combat conditions was nearly impossible. It was too late. The Tiger's reign of invincibility was ending, and the tank crews who had mocked the Sherman were about to learn a brutal lesson in the mathematics of kinetic energy. August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize. The Canadian First Army, supported by British armored units, launched a nighttime assault toward Falaise, attempting to encircle retreating German forces and close the Falaise pocket. Trooper Joe Ekins, a 21-year-old gunner from Rushden, Northamptonshire, sat in the gunner's seat of his Sherman Firefly, called Sign 3 Charlie, part of a squadron, 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Ekins was not a career soldier. Before the war, he'd worked in a boot factory, stitching leather and operating machinery in the same town where generations of his family had lived and worked. His gunnery training had been minimal. 1 familiarization session at the Bovington Range, 5 practice shots total. The recoil of the 17-pounder had surprised him. The entire tank shuddered when the gun fired, and the muzzle blast rattled his teeth. Now, deep in enemy territory, his squadron was advancing through rolling fields south of when reports came in over the radio. Tigers ahead. At approximately 12:30 hours, Ekins' commander, Captain Boardman, spotted 3 Tiger tanks moving in formation across an open field near Saint-Étienne-de-Crampsnil. The Tigers were advancing in a line-abreast formation, confident in their armor and firepower. The range was extreme, 800 meters, near the maximum effective range of the 17-pounder against moving targets. The Tigers had not yet spotted the Fireflies hidden in the tree line, their hulls concealed by the shadows of hedgerows and the dappled light filtering through the leaves. Boardman gave the order quietly, almost calmly. Gunner, Tiger, 800, fire when ready. Ekins aligned his sight picture, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He accounted for the range, the slight crosswind, and the Tiger's movement. The reticles settled on the lead Tiger's flank. Where the armor was thinnest, he squeezed the trigger. The first round struck the lead Tiger just behind the driver's compartment. Penetration. The shell tore through 80 millimeters of side armor, and the interior of the Tiger became a maelstrom of spalling metal and fire. The German crew bailed out, their uniforms smoking, stumbling across the field as secondary explosions erupted from the ammunition racks. Ekins' loader, Trooper Dyson, a wiry kid from Birmingham, rammed another shell into the breech with mechanical efficiency. Up, he shouted. Ekins traversed right, found the second Tiger in his sight, and fired. The second Tiger, realizing it was under fire, attempted to traverse its turret toward the source of the incoming rounds. Too late, the shell struck the turret ring, jamming the turret and penetrating into the crew compartment. The Tiger slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. The third Tiger, recognizing the danger, began reversing at maximum speed, its engine roaring as the driver attempted to escape the killing field. Ekins fired again. The shell struck the rear hull, where the armor was only 60 millimeters thick. The Tiger erupted in flames, its fuel tanks igniting in a fireball that sent a column of black smoke high into the summer sky. 3 Tigers destroyed in less than 90 seconds. Among those Tigers was number 007, Michael Whitman, the most decorated tank ace of the Third Reich, the man who had humiliated the British 7th Armored Division at Villers-Bocage, died in the inferno. His body was never recovered. Whether Ekins's round was a specific one that killed Whitman remains debated. Other Allied units, including rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft, were active in the area, but the evidence strongly suggests Ekins was responsible. Forensic analysis of Tiger 007's wreckage, conducted decades later when the tank was excavated, revealed penetration damage consistent with a 17-pounder armor-piercing round, not rocket fire. Ekins himself never claimed the kill. When pressed by journalists after the war, he simply said, "Whoever killed Whitman doesn't matter. All that matters is that he's gone. And that means one less Tiger for the next bloke to face." The Germans never recovered from the shock. The myth of Tiger invincibility died with Whitman. Across Normandy, Firefly crews continued to rack up kills, proving that superior engineering, not just tonnage or thickness, could turn the tide of armored warfare. By the end of August, the Falaise pocket had closed, trapping tens of thousands of German troops and hundreds of tanks. The Fireflies had played a crucial role in that victory, engaging and destroying German armor at ranges where standard Shermans would have been helpless. The legacy, how the Firefly changed tank warfare. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Sherman Firefly had earned a reputation as the Tiger Killer. Approximately 2,000 Fireflies were produced between January 1944 and May 1945. British doctrine called for 1 Firefly per troop, a unit of 4 tanks, ensuring every small unit had the firepower to engage German heavies without relying on air support or artillery. The Firefly's combination of the Sherman's mechanical reliability and the 17-pounder's lethality made it the most effective Allied tank hunter of the war in the European theater. Its kill-to-loss ratio against Tigers and Panthers exceeded 3-1, a remarkable achievement given that standard Sherman struggled to achieve even parity. The Firefly's success influenced post-war tank design in profound ways. The principle of mounting the largest possible gun on a reliable chassis became doctrine for NATO forces during the Cold War. The British Centurion tank, which entered service in 1945 and remained in frontline service until the 1990s, was a direct descendant of lessons learned from the Firefly. Prioritized firepower and armor over speed. The Centurion mounted a 17-pounder initially, then upgraded to the 20-pounder, and eventually the 105mm L7 gun, which became the NATO standard for decades. The 17-pounder itself remained in service for decades. It armed the Centurion, the Comet, and numerous towed anti-tank guns well into the 1950s and 60s. Commonwealth forces used 17-pounders in Korea, where they proved devastatingly effective against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. Its penetration performance set the benchmark for post-war gun design, proving that velocity, not just caliber or shell weight, determined lethality. The physics were simple. Kinetic energy increases with the square velocity, so doubling muzzle velocity quadrupled penetration potential. This principle drove the development of high-velocity tank guns throughout the Cold War. But perhaps the Firefly's greatest legacy was psychological. It shattered the myth that Allied armor was inferior, that American and British tanks were merely mobile coffins waiting to be incinerated by superior German engineering. Tank crews who felt helpless against Tigers and Panthers suddenly had a weapon that gave them a fighting chance, and more than a chance, a genuine advantage at combat ranges. Morale improved. Crews volunteered for Firefly assignments despite the increased danger of being targeted first. The confidence that came from knowing you could win changed everything. And for the Germans, the arrival of the Firefly marked the moment when the hunter became the hunted. Tiger Cruz, who had grown accustomed to stalking Allied armor with impunity, now had to approach every engagement with caution. The sound of a 17-pounder's distinctive crack, louder and sharper than the 75mm, sent German tank crews scrambling for cover. Panzer commanders who had once boasted about their kill counts grew silent as their own losses mounted. The arrogance that Whitman had embodied, the certainty that German armor was invincible, evaporated in the smoke of burning Tigers across the fields of Normandy. Michael Whitman had laughed at the Sherman, dismissing it as a target rather than a threat. Joe Ekins, with 5 practice shots in the 17-pounder, had the last word. And in the mathematics of war, where velocity equals survival and penetration equals victory, the Firefly proved that engineering brilliance could defeat brute force. The Firefly didn't just kill Tigers. It killed the myth. You've just witnessed how a single overlooked detail turned the tide of battle. Discussions like these continue in our comment section, where historians and engineers debate the finer points. Join our community by subscribing, and bring your insights to the conversation below.